Welcome to today's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, I will turn it over to ASP CEO Patrick Costello.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon from Washington. Welcome to this afternoon's virtual meeting. The American Security Project has a long history of studying how climate change threatens national security. We've worked extensively on how America's military and militaries around the world are taking the threat seriously, how climate change acts as an accelerant of instability and a threat multiplier in fragile political and security situations. And we've posted programs around the country in an effort to educate and inform the American people on the nature of this challenge. And we convene these programs in an effort to provide mechanisms in order to create long-term consensus around big strategic issues facing this country. Joining us this afternoon is a gentleman who recognizes the challenges associated with climate change and is also committed to practical and exportable solutions to provide Americans and the rest of the world with access to cheaper, reliable, and cleaner energy. I'm honored to be joined by Congressman John Curtis of Utah. Congressman Curtis has been serving the people of Utah's 3rd Congressional District since 2017. He sits on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. He's the inaugural chairman of the Conservative Climate Caucus, and the congressman also served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee during previous Congresses. And Congressman, welcome. Thank you for taking the time. We're going to engage in conversation, but I encourage our guests on the line to submit their questions via the Q&A box as well as the chat function, and I'll weave those in where appropriate. I also fully recognize that it's a busy time up on the Hill, and we may have to cut this short due to votes. So when the bells go off, I know you've got to run across the street from the Cannon building. So to start with, I want to get into the current debate up on the Hill, but first, your efforts in the Conservative Climate Caucus are laudable. So my first question to you is, what is it like to be a climate conservative? And how have you seen the debate unfold on the Hill over your tenure in Congress? And where do you see any disconnects between the current debate and actionable solutions?
Patrick, first, good to be with you. We could spend a whole hour on that first question. And you'll excuse me if I chuckle a little bit when you said, what's it like to be a climate conservative? Imagine a Republican talking about climate. And what's great, what's really good news is it's becoming less and less news, if that makes any sense. So just a year ago, when we launched the Conservative Climate Caucus, it was huge news. 75 Republicans joined that caucus. And the first tenet of the caucus is that the climate's changing and Matt's had an influence on it. Well, imagine 75, that's a third of all House Republicans joining that. That was big news. Amazingly, today, it's not such big news, right? That more and more people are understanding that conservatives, Republicans do want a voice in this debate, and that we do have very, very important ideas to bring to the table. And I regret that we've let ourselves be branded somewhat as denying the science and not caring. But I'm here to tell you, and I think 75 Republicans back me up, that's not true, and we want to demonstrate that.
Great, thank you, sir. I do want to get to the big news at hand, and that is the war in Ukraine. I know that you're in Europe at the start of the conflict, and I think the crisis in Ukraine has forced a needed conversation on energy security broadly and has caused a real shift in the behaviors of some of our European partners. So I'd just like to get your views on that.
Well, clearly a sea change, and not just our European partners, but here at home. There's an awakening awareness that some of the decisions made in Europe 10, 20 years ago in an attempt to be green, in an attempt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not only increased greenhouse gas emissions, but took away some strong national security components. And those are important lessons for us here in the United States, because I think we're making some of those same decisions here.
Great, thank you, sir. Earlier this week, the 6th UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, issued its 3rd and final report, and it paints a rather dire picture that we're careening toward levels of global warming that will have irreversible impacts. Now, reading through the summaries of the report, because I didn't read through all 250 some odd pages, admittedly, It also struck a somewhat optimistic tone, noting that we have the solutions at hand. Renewable energy sources like wind and solar are becoming more economically viable and becoming cheaper by the day. But so I have a few related questions. One, I think this report serves as a reminder of how policies lag behind science and technology and even economics. So welcome your thoughts on that. And second, what impact, if any, do these reports have in the debate up on Capitol Hill, particularly amongst the Republican conference?
Well, let me answer that second one first and say, I think it's very, very important. And one of the voices that Republicans bring to this conversation is to note that we could be wildly successful here in the United States and still fail with our climate policies. And I think that's one of the things that Republicans feel very strongly about. And we got a lot of bad press for being grumpy about the Paris agreement. But the reality of it is, it basically said, look, US, you go solve this, get down to zero. And by the way, China, for the next 20 years, you can increase your emissions. Well, that will fail, right? And so we have to have a broader view of this. We've got to look at this from a worldwide greenhouse gas emissions perspective. And in my opinion, too little time is spent on the worldwide picture. And we're asked to make sacrifices here at home, and yet we're going to give a pass to our neighbors increasing their emissions.
Thank you. I want to delve into the realm of the possible up on
Sure.
Capitol Hill. Now, climate policy, as you know all too well, has become politically charged, and the caucus was formed in part to try and advance real policy remedies. So can you discuss what the caucus is currently doing with respect to, first, member education efforts, second, advancing your own legislative agenda, and third, engaging with House Democrats and where there might be points of alignment with the caucus's agenda and that of the current House majority?
Right. Boy, here again, I wish I had an hour just for this, but let me jump into it and say, let me tell you about two efforts that are going on with Republicans right now. So one is the caucus, and the caucus's primary mission is to educate. If I had my way, I'd have every single Republican in Congress totally comfortable with the science, totally comfortable with the solutions, totally comfortable with answers. When asked in a town hall meeting, I'd love every Republican to stand up and say, of course it's changing, of course it's had some influence. Let me tell you what I'm doing about it, right? And then have their own agenda and ready to roll. There is a parallel effort going on right now with Garrett Graves from Louisiana, who's leading a task force put together by Kevin McCarthy. His mission is actually legislative meat on the bones. So the two efforts are really complementary, where ours is education of members and Garrett's is the legislative policies. And he's been working very hard. I'm actually on his committee in coming up with those policy solutions and ideas. Our hope is that as we near the elections, Republicans are able to come out and say, we've told you a long time what we're against, we're going to tell you what we're for. And we'll campaign on that. And then if we're successful in taking the House back, what we'll actually try to implement. Two very, very important things that the success of both are critical, I think, for Republicans. Now, let me address this area, which I believe is vast, and that is overlap between Republicans and Democrats. And let me start this conversation with acknowledging that both sides have extremes, right? The extremes on the right are not healthy. The extremes on the left are not healthy. In the middle, you have a vast number of members who are thoughtful, who want to debate good policy. And I'm just going to throw out a couple of categories that I think there's broad agreement on. The first, I would say, is with renewables and the lacking innovation around storage of renewables. So Republicans are very supportive of renewables. We are. I don't really know anybody that's not. There is a debate about like how much renewables can actually carry the load. But we all agree that there needs to be better storage capacity for renewables. And so I think Republicans and Democrats would love to see innovation on the storage side, and you'll find agreement in that. Second category is what I would call emerging technologies, fusion, hydrogen, new nuclear, and there are a number of things that fit in here. I think Republicans and Democrats would equally roll up their sleeves and go to work on these emerging technologies and giving each one the best life possible. I think we want to be careful as government that we're not picking the winners and losers, but rather creating an environment where the best ideas can rise to the top. The third area, I would probably say there's not as much agreement on, and that's the use of fossil fuels. And Republicans would like to see fossil fuels be part of the solution from two main perspectives. One is U.S. fossil fuels burn much cleaner than many fossil fuels around the country. As an example, U.S. Natural gas burns 40% cleaner than Russian natural gas. So we'd like to see, while we're in this phase where we're burning the massive amounts of Russian petroleum, Venezuela, and Iran, other dirty sources, that we don't discount the role for America's fuel being able to lead the way. The United States has reduced more greenhouse gas emissions than the next 10 greenhouse gas emitting countries combined. How did we do that? We replaced coal with natural gas. Let's use that clean natural gas to replace coal in China and in India. And so there's some disagreement there with the other side. The other portion of that is carbon sequestration, storage, and usage. Republicans would like to see that as more of a possibility for the future. And you'll get, of course, some of my Democratic colleagues who just don't like fossil fuels, right, and don't want to see it discussed. But I threw out one area where we have some differences and a bunch of areas where we agree. And those are big areas where I think we can work together. I might say, too, a number of Democrats have actually approached me since they formed this caucus and said, how do we help? Had lunch with one yesterday, and how can I help? And there are some very supportive Democrats of what we're doing.
That's fantastic to hear, and certainly encouraging. I want to back up a bit to the second basket that you just talked about, and that's emerging technologies. And as you engage, you mentioned several: hydrogen, fusion, new nuclear, and as you engage with a variety of stakeholders working in climate and the energy space, what are some of the most interesting innovations that you see out there? Are the interesting uses of, say, building materials for carbon capture? You've mentioned storage, you've mentioned nuclear. Just what gets you particularly excited? Because there is a whole lot of innovation going on out there.
Boy, two categories. I was quite surprised when I visited Europe a couple of weeks ago and saw the use of hydrogen for storage. In Europe, they have quite a bit of wind, and in many cases, it's excess wind. And so what do you do with that excess wind? Well, let's produce hydrogen. And I saw a steel plant that's still a little bit in prototype stage, but where they expect to produce steel with 100% green hydrogen from wind. And we actually saw it at work. And what I was surprised at, in Europe, they talk about hydrogen has already arrived as a storage technique. We're talking about still here as an emerging technology, but in Europe, they've embraced the fact that this is how they're going to store fuel, is with hydrogen, converting wind, particularly wind, into hydrogen. So that I came back from that and said, wow, US has got to jump on this. So we're behind on the hydrogen. The other one you alluded to was nuclear. We've got a branding problem with nuclear, but that's why I like to talk about no nuclear, where we've dealt with some of the safety issues, some of the disposal issues. Molten salt and other techniques are really very exciting. And I think as we look to the future, nobody has really shown me a path to a carbon-free 2050 without nuclear. It just seems to be a fundamental building block that we've got to be talking about.
Yeah. The nuclear issue is certainly a challenge, and I see two particular challenges. And one is public attitudes towards nuclear energy. And having previously worked up on Capitol Hill in Nevada delegation, I know that the storage question is paramount. And the other is an extremely long permitting process.
Yeah.
So can you just talk a bit about what you and your colleagues on the Hill on both sides of the aisle are doing to educate the public about nuclear as a just trying to write the narrative? And the other, what are you doing on the permitting side in terms of pushing the regulators?
I can tell you, I don't have a conversation without bringing up nuclear if I can help it. I think that we need to talk about it more. We need to get the facts out there. Here's a stunning fact. It's one of the safest forms of power. We hear about the big Chernobyls, right? But we don't hear about every power worker that's fallen off a power line or every electrocution, right? So if you add all those up, nuclear is actually very safe, but we've got a branding problem. We also need to do a better job of educating people about new technologies such as molten salt. As I understand molten salt, you can get that nuclear waste reduced by about 90%. And then there's still discussions about some of those medical isotopes that come off that remaining 10%. that a high percentage of this waste can be used and be very, very powerful for medicine and other solutions. As far as permitting, I had an interesting conversation with Secretary Granholm a couple of weeks ago, where she acknowledged that we had to do better on permitting. Interestingly, the right and the left have an interest here. The left has realized it's hard to get a solar plant permitted. It's hard to get a wind farm permitted. And the barriers that we've put up for permitting are hurting all kinds of innovation, and not just those put forward by the right, but by the left as well. So Secretary Granholm committed to work with us in our caucus on permitting reform. And we need to be looking at this, and particularly in regards to nuclear. I have an organization in Utah, it's called UAMPS. They're partially through the permitting for a small nuclear reactor, 9 years, and they're partially through the process. Well, how many entities can really invest that kind of money into a process that's going to take decades before they can bring power, to their users? It's near impossible. And you're absolutely right that has to be reduced. If I had a magic wand, I'd put nuclear permitting into a warp speed program where we're not skipping any steps like we did with warp speed, but we're getting back quicker, giving them quicker answers and figuring out how to get them through that process quicker.
And one item that's going to take up an increasing amount of time up on Capitol Hill towards the end of this year, and certainly next, is the Farm Bill. Now, there is a tie-in with climate change and the need to partner with farmers and ranchers, especially. We're also in the midst of a potential global food crisis as a result of Russia's incursion into Ukraine. So how do you see the syncing up of climate policies and agricultural policies, and what do you see on the horizon when you and your colleagues do start to put meat on the bones of the Farm Bill, because it expires at the end of 23?
This is my opportunity to make a plug that I think farmers are the best environmentalists in the world. Many of them hate to be called environmentalists, but these are the very people whose livelihoods depend on the health of the earth, and are very, very in tune. And I unfortunately, the movement towards green tends to villainize industries and people, and I regret that sometimes our farmers are villainized in this whole process. We must work with our farmers for solutions. The farming techniques done well can be tremendous contributors to sequestering and keeping carbon in the ground, in their techniques and the things they do. And they can be great partners with us on this. So to your point, as we approach this Farm Bill and really all agricultural issues, we've got to sit down with the agricultural community as partners and not as enemies, or not demonize them, and realize they're as invested in the success as anybody, because their livelihoods depend on it.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A function that I'd like to try and get to in the remaining time that we have with you, Congressman. And again, thank you so much for taking it. One, you mentioned that we need to maintain using fossil fuels. So there's a question in here: while using natural gas versus oil seems practical, does it make sense to spend resources on natural gas versus dedicating those funds toward implementing renewals? So I remember watching Congress for a long time that there was always this all of the above approach within the Republican conference. So can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so we know there are 800 million people, think about that, 800 million people without any form of power. They're burning dung, they're burning wood. As these 800 million people transition, can anybody fathom building windmills and solar farms quick enough to meet their needs? Nobody can fathom that, particularly with the storage problems that we've discussed. And so would we rather that they transition to coal? Would we rather that they transition to fuel from Venezuela or from Russia or from Iran, or use US natural gas, where we control the conditions under which that is produced? And it's clear, not only from an economy standpoint to build the US economy, but just from a green standpoint, that it's a much better option to be using US natural gas than these other sources. And realizing that I don't see anybody that can sit down with me and build a path how windmills and solar farms get us out of this, and particularly until we deal with the storage. And so this is why I think it's a mistake to demonize, just like I mentioned, the farmers, we're demonizing the fossil fuel industry. We're knocking the legs out from underneath them from an investment standpoint with ESG. And let me just let's hypothetically think for a minute. If there was a company that was willing to put billions of dollars into R&D, whether it was for renewables or sequestration or hydrogen, right? Imagine a company out there that was willing to do that. And imagine a company that employs some of the best minds and scientists and engineers in the world. Would we knock their feet out from underneath them? And now think of Exxon and Mobil and Chevron, right? And we're knocking their feet out from underneath them. And these are the very people who have the capital, who have the expertise to innovate us out of here. And I wish we could embrace them as partners rather than demonizing them.
I want to pivot slightly and talk about North America. Now, one thing that the crisis in Ukraine has highlighted is that we are incredibly fortunate to live on a continent at peace and not have belligerent neighbors. And when I look at North America, I see a very promising energy outlook. So how do you see the continent's energy outlook, and what do you think we can do with Mexico and Canada to strengthen the continent's energy infrastructure, to expand energy exports, improve safety, encourage harmonized policies to promote energy conservation and reduce emissions? Do you have any thoughts on how to reduce regulatory barriers to permitting cross-border transmission or the like? Just welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so you can't bring up this topic without talking Keystone XL, right? It's just a really good...
I didn't say it, Congressman.
but let's use it as an example, and it's low-hanging fruit, and I think Republicans talk about this a lot. Is like, okay, so we're against fossil fuels, so we closed down Keystone XL. Well, did we change demand? We didn't. So instead, those same fuels will be trucked in instead of coming through a green pipeline, right, into the United States, increasing greenhouse gas emissions through a policy that was intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sacrificing thousands of US jobs. So I think to answer your question, what we need to do is we need to realize we have standards here in the United States that quite frankly are very high. Let's insist on those standards from our neighbors to the north and the south. And to the extent that they'll meet those standards, let's embrace them as clean sources, right? Even if fossil fuels, here again, that are cleaner than Iran, than Venezuela, than Russia. And that right now we need those fuels and we need them from cleaner sources. And so let's make it easier to move them through a green pipeline rather than being trucked. Let's build that infrastructure so that these can flow right around the country in a greener way, and realize that done well will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Done poorly will increase greenhouse gas emissions.
Let's pivot briefly back to emerging technologies. And one issue that the American Security Project has worked on for quite some time is fusion. So I'd welcome your thoughts on fusion more broadly. It seems to be within the last year or two, there's been some real scientific breakthroughs, but it still seems quite some way off in terms of actually bringing that technology online. So how do you and your colleagues in the Republican conference think about fusion as a potentially transformative energy technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I predict 50 years from now, when you and I sit down to talk about this, we'll look back and we'll see some things that we can't see today that were fundamental building blocks of this transition, and we don't want to overlook any of those. Fusion has the potential to be one of those fundamental game changers because it can be produced so cleanly, right, and provide so much energy. So some of the game changers out there, some of the renewables, right, they work very well, but they can't replace vast amounts of energy, at least right now. And so I view fusion as, yes, we need to pour everything into it. We need to give it as much life as possible, because if successful, and there are some promising things out there, that's the game changer that could really change the whole energy solution for the world.
When we think about energy security and climate policy matters, it cuts across so many different jurisdictional boundaries up on the Hill, from actual energy policy to trade policy to foreign policy to things that are under the auspices of the armed services committees. Now, one question that's popped up in the chat is concerning carbon border adjustments.
Yeah.
So just your thoughts on carbon border adjustments more broadly, but there's a piece of legislation under consideration in the Senate. I'm not sure if it's got a companion in the House, but it's Senator Kramer's bill looking to force India and China to basically clean up their act a bit by using CBAs.
So I think if we approach it this way, and let me tell you what I mean, it's like we've got American businesses and they've got these restraints on them of safety, of human rights, of emissions, and they're going to produce a toaster and put it on the shelf of, we'll say Walmart, right? And now you've got a Chinese competitor who doesn't have the constraints of human rights, of emissions, of safety, and they're going to put a toaster on the shelf in Walmart, and they're just $5 and ours is $10, right? Why in the world are we letting that happen, right? That's just, we're destroying U.S. business, we're destroying U.S. manufacturing, and we're subsidizing a dictator. Listen, I love the Chinese people. I speak Mandarin, I've spent time over there. I'm not worried about the Chinese people, I'm worried about a Chinese dictator, right? And in many cases, the Chinese people are victims themselves. Why are we subsidizing him? So there is some thoughtful discussion among Republicans. I wouldn't say it's broad-based yet, but there is some thoughtful discussion about should we be adjusting something at the border so that toaster bears the burden of that human rights, of the emissions, of the safety. So it's sitting next to that U.S. Toaster. And I think there's room for the discussion there. Now, I'm not gonna lie, a carbon tax in general is not very popular. It's not just Republicans, it's Democrats as well. So I'm trying to figure out how to do this without a carbon tax, but simply a border adjustment. And I'm having some conversations I think are very, very encouraging around that. And I'd like to better understand it myself, and I'd like to broaden that discussion among other Republicans.
Great. Well, I hope some of our listeners on the line take that to heart and start flooding your office with some literature. Because I know as a former staffer, there's nothing better than just having your boss send out a demand signal and getting a whole lot into your inbox.
Yeah.
Now, one aspect that again ASP has worked a lot on is improving the climate resilience of the military, and looking at our military installations across the country, the climate risks associated with them, and their resilience to those potential impacts. So how is this issue being discussed within the Conservative Climate Caucus? I've had a number of conversations with your colleagues who are on the Armed Services Committee, and I know that this is always something they think about in the annual NDAA. I'm just wondering more broadly within your colleagues who aren't necessarily sitting on HASC.
So I would tell you, we like to talk about it, but even in a broader context, and that is, what's going to happen to everything in 10, 20, and 30 years? And here's a reality. People like to say, stick to the science. Science backs me up on this. The trajectory is warming. If we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow worldwide, we are still on a warming trajectory that would take a number of years to change, meaning we're going to see rising sea levels. We're going to see deserts for where we can grow things, right? We're going to see these impacts, and we're not paying enough attention to them. Republicans, Democrats, all of us, right, are not paying enough attention to the realities of a warming Earth. Despite our best efforts, like I say, if we got to zero, we're still going to see these impacts. And I think we need to spend more time talking about, well, why are we building homes on the shoreline that were destroyed when we know that the seas are going to rise, right? Why are we not mitigating some of these damages right now? And quite frankly, the cost to mitigate is far less than going in later on, right, and dealing with this. So I hope to inspire a conversation around that as well, is let's start looking at mitigating from the warming climate. Here again, that trajectory, you can factor in all sorts of models, right, and get it to bend, but it's going up, and it's going up for some time, no matter what we do.
Well, Congressman, we are at the half-hour mark. I, again, fully appreciate how busy a time it is up on the Hill. I thank you for your time this afternoon, but also really for your leadership, your ability to bring together a diverse group of your Republican colleagues, 75 at last count, into this caucus is notable and appreciated. And if there's ever anything that the American Security Project can do to assist you and your colleagues, please do not hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And the buzzers that you're hearing behind me, they're pretty obnoxious, but that does signal the vote. Really good to be with you, Patrick. Best of luck, and I hope we stay in touch.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.